Well, the Russians recently took this strategic town of Sabotage and is advancing to the surrounding regions. And then further south, Russia recently took Lyshivka and is advancing a bit north to Chasiv Yar. So this is starting to look like a pincer movement around all of Bakhmut city. Indeed, some people are saying that there's an operational encirclement already, even though there's still one road left they can live on. And in the south, it appears that Russia activated this Sabotage front line and moved several kilometers north. But, with still hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers not yet having entered the fight, how are you reading this? Is this the beginning of the Russian winter offensive, or they're just, choosing their positions before they storm, or what? Or will there be a huge offensive? Will it continue to be this gradual grinding down the army? How do you read the situation based on your background?
Well, if you look at the map and you look at the size of these operations, people call them operational. I suppose you could make that argument, but these are small scale. They're what we call shaping operations, where you are deliberately destroying the various lines of defense. It's generally accepted that the Ukrainians have 3 lines of defense in the Donbass. The first 2 are largely destroyed, and the third is not very strong and has turned out to be relatively weak, which is why I think you're seeing these sudden advances. And, of course, they're running out of people. And I'm sure Ukrainian commanders have argued that this is the time to withdraw forces, to prevent them from being destroyed, so that we can build up a viable reserve force and we can fall back to defensible terrain. But again, this is the problem. If we fall back, is the argument in Kiev, well, then we're seen as weak, and that people will think we can't win. Well, people have already reached that conclusion at high levels as it is. So no, these are shaping operations. The major offensives, you're looking at over 100,000 combat troops down in the south that will advance north. You can look at where these shaping operations have occurred, and you can make up your mind where you think these advances will come from in the south. You have another 100,000 combat troops over near Beograd that are faced across from Kharkov, and those are poised to attack. And they stretch all the way down to the Oxal River. Then you have another roughly 80 to 100,000 Russian combat troops in Belarus. I'm not as confident in those numbers because it may be more, it may be less. It's hard to see up there right now. Even the people with satellite overhead views are having difficulty with precise numbers. But we've seen an enormous quantity of equipment arrive there, all of it brand new. The same thing in the other areas, but certainly in Belarus. And then people say, well, I hear lots of people say, well, they can execute a 3-pronged, super envelopment from the north out of Belarus, from the east in central Ukraine, and from the south in southern Ukraine. Well, I suppose you could, but I don't see that as the Russian way of war at this stage. I think that you will see something on a larger scale associated with the slow, deliberate meat grinder approach that is being applied with great success in southern Ukraine. Now, if there are large openings and vast open spaces, and if you look at the map, and people really need to study the maps in Ukraine. I remember months ago we had Army retired generals coming on talking about, the Ukrainians are doing such a brilliant job, and just look at these pictures, and all those pictures were nonsense. It was just GameStop crap. If you look at the terrain north of Zaporozhye, it's flat. There is some undulating terrain, but most of it is pretty flat. I don't know what's up there, and I'm getting the impression more and more every day that there isn't really very much there. And if that indeed is the case, you might see something greater than the sort of slow, deliberate grind. You may see a more rapid advance. But the Russians have proven over the last few months to be very deliberate. They understand the impact of linking the overhead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, terrestrial and space-based, to the various strike systems. They've used their Air Force very effectively as well as part of this larger strike approach. I don't see that changing very much. I don't think they're going to put ground forces at risk of being suddenly attacked by weapons and troops that they have not already identified by moving too quickly. But those slow, deliberate grinds will have an effect. My own My own thinking is that we're going to see all of this happen in the East first. And when the East is largely devoid of Ukrainian resistance and cleared, that's when you will see crossing of the Dnieper River and the northern offensive begin, because one of the stated goals from the very beginning of this discussion about offensives has been to cut off Ukraine from the Polish border. That has to happen. And something is going to have to be done about the regime in Kiev. But that will be the last thing that I think is on the agenda.
Yeah, because it definitely seems from looking at the map that the Sabotage front has to be something real, because, again, if you move north from Sabotage, you can cut off Sabotage, Dnipro, all the way up to Kiev, then everything east of the Dnieper would be cut off. But I was wondering, though, because the Russians may have the men now up to 600,000, but if they would activate all of them at the same time, wouldn't this put a huge strain on the manufacturing logistics of the supply of weapons? Because one of the advantages of Russia now is they can just fire off all the artillery, the rockets they want. That's because they have the production, in the back. But if all their men will be armed to the teeth with the same kind of firepower, could they sustain this, or does this indicate that they would probably do a slower, grinding mission?
My impression is the manufacturing facilities for all these weapon systems are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in Russia. As a result, there will be no shortage. That's wishful thinking. That's the least of your concerns, or of their concerns. The larger issue is what we talked about before. Given what they have learned over the last several months, warfare has clearly changed. The dominant feature on the battlefield is what we call ISR strike. This integration of the overhead surveillance at every level with multiple strike systems. That becomes, if you will, a huge umbrella over the entire Ukrainian state area. The Russians are not going to move their forces anywhere that they are not under that umbrella. Therefore, the movements will not be mad dashes to seize a bridge over the Dnieper. These will be, I don't want to say slow, but methodical, deliberate. And it will move under the crushing weight of these strike systems. That's why this is not going to end in 30 days. It's not going to end in 60 days. It may be 90 or 120, simply because they are being methodical, and they will destroy all of the Ukrainian resistance. But it just won't look like a World War II blitzkrieg. I keep hearing people talk about blitzkrieg. That was a different era, and that kind of capability exists, but it's not something that you do in this era where you have ISR strike arrayed against you. And even though the Ukrainian capabilities are much degraded and denuded of what they had earlier, it's still a danger. And the Russians have made it very clear, the commanding generals have made it clear, they're not interested in sacrificing Russian lives unnecessarily. So they'll be methodical and they'll be deliberate, as opposed to on the fly or battlefield opportunists in the old German sense of the word. But I see the eastern side taking presidents first over the West. That doesn't mean they won't go west. I think they'll have to. And every day that we open our mouths and characterize the Russians in the very negative way that we do, and make these outrageous demands of them, and keep talking about regime destruction and dismemberment of Russia as the long-term goal, the more likely it becomes that the Russians will have to move all the way to the Polish and Romanian and Moldovan borders.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask about, because can there really be negotiations anymore? Because I often look at Moscow's perspective, and from that perspective, NATO countries, the sabotage the previous Minsk II agreement for 7 years, and then again, when Russia invaded to impose a settlement, the US and UK convinced Kiev to again abandon negotiations. So there's quite little trust in Moscow at the moment, and also the fear obviously would be that if there would be a peace, the West would merely do as it did with the last agreement, simply use it as an opportunity to arm Ukraine to the teeth again and, continue the fight. But again, and this is what we're indicating quite often, speaking a bit too openly perhaps, but making matters worse, now we also declare this intention that we're going to fight Russia in perpetuity, and, given even NATO membership to Ukraine after the war. Even Henry Kissinger suggested this in Davos. So this places, Moscow in a very difficult position, because whatever territory it does not take now will end up in NATO's hands. So, and also, it would be dangerous to have two strategic territory which would be used against it, which suggests Russia would have, all the incentive to seize the coastline, to take the areas of economic interest, that is the agriculture, the industrial areas, the areas with natural resources, and obviously the regions with the Russian speakers, as they wouldn't want them to live under NATO rules. So, so given that we're declaring this goal of breaking Russia, what does this mean for negotiations? Can there be any settlement now that we see, some cracks in Ukraine?
Well, on the face of it, it would suggest no, because there's no one that the Russians are inclined to believe at this stage. I mean, how much faith should they put in anything that is said by Zelenskyy or Biden or, Biden's cabinet members and his government? For that matter, it probably also applies to London and perhaps other European governments. Your own is another example, and then there's Finland. This attitude that somehow or another, overnight, Russia must be destroyed. It's interesting because I was reading a document that was authored by George Soros over 10 years ago, in which he talked specifically about this kind of all-out war that would ultimately come against Russia, because he said this is the last nationalist state that rests on a foundation, obviously, of Orthodox Christian culture with Russian identity at its core. That has to be removed. So I think the people that are in charge of the West and in charge in Washington think that they have successfully destroyed the national identities of the European and American peoples, that we have no sense of ourselves, our borders are undefended, we present no resistance to incoming migrants from the developing world who essentially roll over us as though we owe them a living and that our laws do not count. Thus far, I would say that's a pretty good assessment, an accurate evaluation of what we've been doing. I think that's a great victory for George Soros and the globalists, the anti-nationalists, those who want open borders, and they call it an open society, which means that you end up with nothing, an amorphous mass of people struggling to survive who are reduced to the lowest levels of subsistence. So that's in the background. And in fact, he even goes so far as talking about how useful it would be if East Europeans were the ones that whose lives were expended in this process, and not West Europeans who simply will not take the casualties. This is not a minor matter. This is the sort of thinking that is so destructive and so evil, in my judgment, that's really what we are dealing with in our own countries, and I think Putin recognizes that. So for him, it's existential, and I think the Russian people see it this way. These reports of, the Russians are miserable and want to get rid of Putin. I guess you can find somebody over there. I don't know how many, but certainly in the high 80s, he has approval ratings. And I'd say that if anybody tried to remove the man, he'd probably be killed or cut down long before he got near the Kremlin.